Arthur Miller's final confession to Marilyn was the most devastating thing he ever said. Arthur Miller thought his secret was buried until he picked up the phone for one final devastating call to Marilyn Monroe. Inside his typewriter sat a single 12-word note that would eventually shatter her spirit, a note that revealed the terrifying truth behind their perfect marriage. Tonight, we uncover the private conversation that the world was never meant to witness. It was a humid August night in Brentwood, the kind of heavy, silent evening where the only sound is the frantic, rhythmic beating of a moth against a lampshade, desperate and doomed. Inside the small house on 5th Helena Drive, a single light burned in the bedroom, casting long, tired shadows across the face of a woman who had become the world's most beautiful mystery, a riddle written in platinum and red silk. Marilyn was alone, wrapped in a white silk robe that seemed too heavy for her fragile frame, staring at a telephone that felt like a coiled snake on her bedside table, waiting with cold, electrical patience to strike at the center of her solitude. The silence of that room was thick, almost suffocating, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and the lingering, dusty scent of old memories that refused to fade despite the passage of time. For months, she had lived in a world of whispers, where every creak of the floorboards felt like a judgment, a reminder of the millions of eyes that never stopped watching, even in the dark. She was 36 years old, yet in the dim, amber light, she looked like a lost child waiting for a parent who would never come home. Lost in a house that had been bought with stardom but had never quite felt like a sanctuary. Her life had been a series of bright, blinding lights and deafening, hollow applause. But here, in the quiet, the only thing she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat of rising anxiety. She had reached a point where the world saw a goddess carved in marble, but the mirror showed a woman who was slowly fading away, losing the desperate battle to keep hold of her own true identity. Then, at precisely midnight, the telephone shattered the stillness with a violence that made her heart skip a beat, echoing like a gunshot in a cathedral. It didn't just ring, it screamed, vibrating through the empty hallways like a sudden, sharp accusation, a phantom voice demanding to be heard. Her hand trembled, fingers pale and shaking as she reached for the receiver, hovering over the cold plastic with a mixture of desperate hope and paralyzing dread. Who would call at this hour? The press with their prying, hungry questions? The studio with another cold demand for her smile? A ghost from her past seeking penance? She had spent so long trying to escape the voices that demanded things from her smile, her time, her very soul, giving until there was nothing left but shadows. But this ring was different. It was persistent, intimate, as if the person on the other end knew exactly how lonely she was at that very moment, calling out across the void into her isolation. She finally picked it up, her breath hitching in her throat, a soft, tentative hello, barely escaping her lips, thin as paper and just as easily torn. There was a pause on the other side, a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing, suspended in a frozen pocket of time. And then, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 long, agonizing years spoke her name, sending a jolt of cold electricity through her spine. It was Arthur Miller, the intellectual giant of American theater who had parsed her soul like a script for a play, now calling from the wreckage of their divorce with a voice that sounded like heavy, ancient stone. It wasn't the voice of a fan or a cold director. It was a voice that had once promised her the world, only to leave her standing in the rain of a broken marriage, shivering and abandoned. It was Arthur. Her heart didn't just beat, it fractured, the sound of his intellectual, measured tone cutting through the dark like a knife through silk, precise, familiar, and devastatingly painful. If this story is touching your heart, please hit that subscribe button to join our community and never miss a moment of these legendary tales as we explore the real human hearts behind the fame. The man who had seen her soul and then wrote a play about her flaws was on the line, and he sounded as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep, dark well, his words echoing with a hollow, long-awaited regret. He didn't offer pleasantries or ask how she was doing. He spoke as if they were picking up a conversation they had left unfinished in a courtroom years ago, a dialogue that had been playing on a loop in his mind for 2 years of silence. To understand the weight of this call, you have to remember the farmhouse in Connecticut, the place where the intellectual titan and the golden starlet tried to build a life amidst leather-bound books and damp garden soil, hoping to escape the noise of the world. But the world watched it crumble during the filming of The Misfits as the desert heat exposed every crack in their foundation until the house itself felt like a stage set. Now, the air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving Marilyn gasping for a reason to stay on the line, yet unable to let go of the only tether she had to a man she had once called her home. She held the cold plastic to her ear, the weight of 1,000 unsaid words pressing down on her chest, a physical burden of history that made it hard to breathe. He breathed her name again, but this time there was a tremor in his voice, a crack in his intellectual armor that changed everything she thought she knew about their final days together. Hearing Arthur's voice after so much silence felt like a shiver through time, a cold draft blowing through a room she had tried so hard to keep warm with expensive illusions. It was a sound that belonged to another life, carrying a weight that made her realize this was not a call of convenience, but a call of absolute necessity, a final attempt to speak before the light went out forever. For a long minute, she couldn't find her own voice, that soft, breathy whisper that had been analyzed by critics and adored by millions until it felt like a costume she could never take off. In this moment, it was trapped behind a wall of memories she had carefully built to survive the loneliness of her Brentwood nights. She remembered the way he used to look at her, not as a woman, but as a riddle he was trying to resolve, a complex puzzle that never quite fit into his logic or his life. Now, as the line crackled with static, the power dynamic had shifted in the dark. He wasn't the giant of American theater, and she wasn't the starlet in need of saving. They were just two people haunted by the ghosts of their shared passing time, two shadows reaching out across a void of deep, permanent misunderstanding. Arthur spoke again, and this time, his words were a jagged apology for the distance between them, a distance he had helped to build stone by stone during their years together. He talked about the house they had shared and the garden she had tried to grow, detailing the small things he had kept of hers. A stray earring found in the back of a drawer, a dried flower from a bouquet she'd forgotten on the windowsill. It was a sensory flood that threatened to pull her under, a wave of nostalgia that she wasn't prepared to face in the middle of the night. She had spent so much energy pretending she didn't miss him, convincing herself that she was better off in the golden cage of Hollywood where she was safe but utterly alone. But the sound of him breathing on the other end of the line made the cage feel smaller, colder, and hollow, stripped of all its gold and glamour. The tragedy of their love was that it had always been a conversation between two people who spoke entirely different languages, their hearts out of sync like two clocks in different time zones. He lived in his head, in the world of metaphors and grand, sweeping themes, while she lived in her heart, where the pain was real and didn't need a script or a monologue to explain it. She closed her eyes, imagining him in his study, surrounded by stacks of paper and the faint, familiar smell of pipe tobacco that had once signaled safety. She could almost see the lines of worry etched deeper into his face, the guilt that had clearly been festering since the day they walked away from each other without looking back at what they were leaving behind. He confessed that he had picked up the phone 100 times over the last year only to put it back down, afraid of what her voice would do to his logic, his resolve, and his carefully constructed world. Marilyn felt a single tear trace a path through the makeup she hadn't yet washed away, a salty trail of heat against her cold skin. It was the first time she had felt truly seen in years, and yet the vision was bittersweet, coming far too late to mend the damage they had done to each other. They were circling a truth that neither had the courage to voice, a realization that they were more connected in their loneliness than they had ever been in the heat of their marriage. As she listened, the world outside her Brentwood window seemed to vanish, the city of stars becoming irrelevant and small. There were only the two of them suspended in a vacuum of regret and unspoken longing, a private universe held together by a fragile phone line. Then Arthur took a sharp breath, the sound of a man standing on the edge of a great jagged height looking down into the abyss. He told her there was something he had buried deep in the pages of his work, a truth he was only now brave enough to uncover, casting aside his creative vanity for a moment of human honesty. Arthur mentioned a note he had once left in a typewriter, a scrap of yellow paper he thought she had never seen, but Marilyn's breath caught because she had carried the memory of those words like a hidden scar for years, a secret that had never left her side. The room in Brentwood felt as if it were shrinking, the air growing heavy with the scent of old paper and the bitter truth that had finally ripened into something lethal. She remembered finding it on a rainy Tuesday in their farmhouse, a stray thought Arthur had typed out and then abandoned, never imagining his wife would read the ink while it was still wet. He had written exactly 12 words, but they were 12 words that acted like a slow-moving toxin in her spirit, changing the way she looked at him and the way she saw herself in the mirror every morning she woke up beside him. He had written, I love the idea of you more than the reality of us." Arthur spoke of the devastating impact those 12 words had on their shared bond. If you have ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about love, share your thoughts in the comments below. As Arthur spoke of it now, his voice trembling over the line with an ancient, heavy grief, Marilyn felt the old ache bloom again, fresh and sharp as a fresh cut on a winter morning. Those words had stripped away the glamour, the fame, and the hope she had pinned on their union like a fragile, shining badge. They told her that she was an acquisition, a beautiful symbol he had wanted to conquer to prove his own intellectual depth, only to find that the living, breathing woman was too complex, too messy, and too demanding of a love he didn't know how to provide. She wasn't a partner to him. She was a concept that had lost its luster once it had to be lived with every single day in the harsh morning light. She had spent the rest of their marriage trying to live up to that idea, trying to be the person he wanted her to be, so she wouldn't have to face the hollow reality he had already accepted. She had dyed her hair a brighter gold, practiced her lines with more fervor, and tried to shrink her needs until they were invisible, all to prove that the reality of her was worth his time. But you cannot compete with a ghost or a fictional ideal created in a man's head. By the time he wrote The Misfits, he wasn't looking at Marilyn anymore. He was looking at the wreckage of an intellectual experiment that had failed to deliver the perfection he craved, using her very ruin to fuel his creative fire. The devastation wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the realization that Arthur had known this since the beginning, long before the vows were even dry on the paper. He had walked down the aisle with a woman he had already given up on, keeping the door to his true inner life locked tight while she pounded on it for years, begging to be let in. This was the silent poison that had drained the life from their home, the secret knowledge that he was just waiting for the fantasy to end so he could return to his typewriter and turn their failure into a theme for a New York stage. She leaned her head against the wall, the cool plaster a sharp contrast to the heat rising in her chest, a heat of anger and ancient sadness. She had finally heard him admit to the note, but the confirmation didn't bring peace. It only highlighted the tragedy of a love that was built on a pedestal of intellectual pride instead of solid human ground. For the first time in their long, painful history, Marilyn stopped being the fragile porcelain doll and found the strength to shatter the silence herself. In this moment, the bombshell didn't explode. She solidified, finding a core of steel that had long been hidden under the layers of her persona. The receiver was warm against her ear, but her voice was steady, cutting through the long-distance static with a clarity that seemed to startle even the ghost of the man on the other end, who had forgotten she had a voice that could stand on its own. "Arthur," she began, her breath hitching only once before she found her rhythm, strong and clear as a winter bell. "You speak about the world breaking me, but you never noticed how much of the breaking happened right in front of you, under your roof." She talked about the suffocating pressure of being the intellectual wife, of sitting in rooms filled with brilliant men where she was expected to be a decorative ornament who understood the subtext of every tragedy but wasn't allowed to have a voice of her own. She had tried so hard to read the books he loved, to understand the complex geometry of his thoughts, only to realize that while she was looking for a home in him, he was looking for a metaphor in her, a character to examine for his next project. She described the lonely afternoons in Connecticut, watching him walk toward his writing shack while she stood in the kitchen, feeling the weight of a silence that was louder than any applause she had ever received in a theater. She hadn't wanted a philosopher or a titan. She had wanted a man who could see her without a spotlight, who didn't feel the need to analyze her soul before he decided it was worth holding. Every time she reached for him, she felt as though she were reaching through a thick pane of glass. She could see him, she could touch the cold surface, but the warmth of his true self was always just out of reach, reserved for his art and kept under lock and key. The tragedy of their time together, she told him, was that he was so busy writing about the human condition that he forgot how to be human with the woman who shared his bed. He treated her emotions like scenes that needed editing, her fears like plot points that needed resolution to satisfy his narrative structure. She wasn't an actress playing a part in their marriage. She was a woman whose heart was breaking in real time, yet he only seemed interested in the performance in the way she looked when she was coming undone. To him, her struggle was a grand drama he could analyze from a safe distance, but to her, it was just the terrifying reality of waking up every day and wondering if she would ever be enough to stop him from turning his back on her in his mind. The room in Brentwood felt larger now, as if her confession had finally cleared the heavy, stagnant air of years of repression and unvoiced pain. She was no longer the blonde bombshell or the tragic muse. She was Marilyn, and she was finally telling her truth without the need for a script or a director. She told him that his distance had been a slow, cold erasing of her life, a way of telling her that she was only interesting to him when she was in pain. She had been starving for a simple love that didn't require an intellectual map to navigate, a love that didn't treat her vulnerability like a manuscript to be reviewed for flaws and corrected in the margins. As she spoke, she realized that Arthur remained silent not out of respect, but out of a crushing realization that his distance was the very thing he was now trying to mourn, a self-inflicted wound he was only just beginning to feel. But then, his voice returned, heavier than before, confessing to a betrayal that went far beyond emotional neglect. Arthur paused, the silence stretching across the telephone line until it felt like a physical weight, heavy with the burden of an ultimate betrayal. He confessed that during their darkest months, he hadn't just been observing her as a husband, he had been keeping a secret journal of her most vulnerable moments, documenting her tears and her late-night terrors to use as material for a future play, turning her life into a rough draft for his fame. The realization hit Marilyn with the force of a tidal wave, chilling her to the very core of her being, making her soul feel exposed and naked. She had opened her heart to him in the sanctuary of their farmhouse, believing that her pain was private and safe from the prying world. Instead, she found that she was being studied like a specimen under glass, her agony nothing more than a footnote in his research. She had been trusting a ghostwriter with her soul, never realizing that he was waiting for her to break so he could describe the sound of the cracking to an audience of strangers. He had looked at her not with the eyes of a lover, but with the cold, calculating gaze of an artist who saw her passing into despair as a creative opportunity to be exploited for the sake of the stage. Marilyn finally realized that her trust had been sold for a story. If this revelation of betrayal makes you look at the myth of their marriage differently, share this video with someone who values authentic love over empty fame. Marilyn stood up, the white silk of her robe pooling around her like a shroud, feeling an overwhelming sense of exposure that fame had never matched. She had spent her entire life being watched by the world, but she had believed that behind closed doors she was finally invisible, finally safe with a man she loved. To discover that the person who held the key to the door was the one shining the harshest light was a devastation that words could barely touch. It confirmed that she was never truly seen for who she was, only for what she could represent on a stage. She had become an artifact in her own home, a legend in her own bed, and the man who should have been her greatest protector was the one who had profit in his heart for her tears, stealing her reality to decorate his fiction. The betrayal was complete because it stole the only thing she had left, the truth of her own experience, turning it into someone else's intellectual property. If her life was just a draft for his next play, then what part of her was actually real? As the weight of this revelation settled over her, she gripped the receiver until her hand throbbed with the tension, her voice a hollow whisper as she asked the one question that had been haunting her since the very first day they met in that New York office years ago. "Have you ever seen me, Arthur, or did you only see the light I cast for everyone else?" The question hung in the air, vibrating with a fragility that made the long-distance connection seem to hum with electric tension, ready to snap under the weight of the truth. Marilyn was leaning against the cold glass of her bedroom window now, looking out at the darkened palms of Brentwood, her reflection a pale, ghost-like figure staring back from the black night, almost transparent in her grief. The silence that followed was so absolute that she could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds of a life that felt like it was slipping through her fingers like sand. On the other end of the line, Arthur Miller, a man celebrated for his command of the English language, found himself utterly bankrupt of words, his intellect finally failing him when it mattered most. He knew, and she knew, that the answer to this question would define whether their entire history had been a genuine connection or just a beautifully written illusion of love. She thought of all the times she had changed her walk, her voice, and her spirit just to catch a glimpse of recognition in his eyes. A sign that he saw the girl from the orphanage, not the goddess from the silver screen, but that look had never come. The tragedy of the moment was the realization that Arthur was struggling because he realized his own failure, a man who searched for truth but had lied to his own heart. Marilyn felt a single tear slip down her cheek, cold and silent, as she realized that his delay was his confession, a confirmation that he had missed her while she was standing right in front of him. The phone felt like lead in her hand, a conduit for a heartbreak that was reaching its final, devastating crescendo. Then, just as the silence threatened to break her completely, Arthur's breath hitched, and he spoke with a raw, shattered honesty she had never heard. It was the sound of a man finally dropping his pen and picking up his life, leaving the character of Marilyn behind to face the woman she really was. Arthur broke then, his voice finally shedding the cold, intellectual skin of the world-famous playwright, exposing a vulnerability he had always hidden behind his prestige. "Marilyn," he whispered, "I never stopped loving you, but I was too small for the magnitude of your light." His pride finally shattered in the face of her brilliance. The confession rippled through the receiver, arriving not as a comfort, but as a devastating weight that made her knees buckle, the very ground feeling unstable. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the silk of her robe rustling like the breath of a ghost in the dark room. It was a love confession that came with the crushing realization that love, no matter how profound, was sometimes a burden a man simply could not carry without breaking under the gravity of it. He talked about the paralyzing fear that had controlled him while they were together. The fear that he would be swallowed by the whirlwind of her celebrity, that he would vanish in her blinding shadow. He admitted that his distance was a shield against her heat. He had never intended for that shield to become the weapon that would finish what the world had started. He simply didn't know how to stand in that fire without fading away, a moth lured to a flame that was simply too bright to survive. Marilyn realized that the very things that made her exceptional were the things that made her impossible for him to hold, her own brilliance becoming her lonely prison. They were two people who had found each other in the dark, only for one of them to turn on a light that was too bright for the other to bear, creating shadows that could not be crossed by any bridge. The line went quiet for a moment. The only sound was the collective heartbeat of two people who finally understood that their story was truly over, the final pages were empty, and the ink had run dry. The realization that this was the final time they would ever speak settled over the room like a soft, heavy blanket of snow, damping every sound and silencing every regret. Marilyn gripped the phone, her hand no longer trembling, but steady with a strange, heavy new resolve. They began to find a moment of mutual forgiveness, a bridge built of whispers and sighs across the empty years. There were no more characters to play and no more critics to satisfy. There were only Arthur and Norma Jean, the children they had been before the world demanded they be icons of something bigger than themselves. Arthur told her to take care of herself, his voice thick with the fatherly concern he had been too prideful to show during their marriage, a love that finally recognized her fragility. He told her she was a light that would never truly dim, even if he were no longer there to see it, a promise to keep her in the quiet corner of his heart where the writing stopped. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said, her voice a soft, final melody that drifted into the silence of the Brentwood house. On the other end, there was a pause, a long, agonizing second where the past 5 years flickered before them, before he whispered the same in return, his voice hollow and thin. The click of the line was the softest sound in the world, yet it echoed through the empty hallways like a thunderclap, signaling the absolute end of an era. She walked to the window to close the curtains against the coming gray dawn, and she felt a strange lightness, as if she were leaving behind a part of herself that she no longer needed to carry. A ghost finally laid to rest in the quiet of the night. The legend of Marilyn Monroe has always been told through the eyes of the men who couldn't keep her, but the truth of that final midnight call remains the most beautiful secret of her myth. It reveals that in her final days, she found the absolute courage to stand in her own truth and forgive the man who wasn't big enough to love her. This historical truth transforms our memory of her from a victim into a victor of the heart, a woman who finally claimed her own narrative back from the storytellers. For every person who has ever felt invisible while standing in a crowd, Marilyn's story is a sanctuary, a reminder that we are seen by our own light even when others are blind. Her legacy is the heartbeat of every soul that has been brave enough to ask, "Did you see me?" and strong enough to keep living when the answer was less than they deserved. If Marilyn's courage to speak her truth resonated with you, show your support by hitting the like button. To journey deeper into the untold stories of legends who changed the world with their silent strength, click subscribe and join our community. Marilyn Monroe taught the world how to look at her, but in that final talk, she taught us how to see each other with empathy. every story matters, and we're truly glad you're here to witness this. One tonight. Thanks for watching and for remembering the woman behind the light.